Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just wait just a few more minutes so that those attending can hop on. I hope that all of you can see and hear me. Just give it one more minute. Okay. Welcome all of you to our JCRC Fed Talk this afternoon on the Abraham Accords. But before I introduce Jen to introduce our speaker, let me introduce myself. I'm Rabbi Ellen Bernhardt, the director of the JCRC at the Jewish Federation of Delaware. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Richard Levine, the president of the Jewish Federation of Delaware, and Russ Silberglied, the vice president of Federation, who arranged this program. So Russ, thank you very much. And also Seth Katzen, the CEO of Federation as well. The way that the program will go is that I will introduce Jen to introduce our speaker, Steve Knable, who will present for roughly half an hour, and then we'll leave a half an hour for questions and answers. All of you will be muted. Please put your questions in the chat. Chat is at the bottom of the screen. So please make sure that the questions go to everyone so we can see the questions, and especially to Jen, who will be filtering them. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce Jen Steinberg, the chair of the Jewish Community Relations Committee, to frame this afternoon's program. Jen.
All right, great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for one of our lunchtime Fed Talks today. Again, my name is Jen Steinberg, and I am the chair of the Jewish Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation of Delaware. And we are very excited to welcome Steve Knable today to speak with us about the importance and the impact of the Abraham Accords. Steve is the Mid-Atlantic Regional Political Director for AIPAC, and in this role, he is solely in charge of managing relationships between AIPAC lay leaders from Virginia to New Jersey and the 46 members of Congress that represent them. He is primarily in charge of building relations with candidates and incoming members of Congress. In that role, he does a significant amount of political education programming, as he'll be doing here, to better prepare AIPAC's lay leaders and staff in achieving their ultimate goal of strengthening the U.S. Israel relationship. Prior to his 9 years at AIPAC, Steve worked on Capitol Hill in Annapolis for the Maryland Senate President and ran local, state, and federal campaigns in Maryland. He is a graduate of the George Washington University, Johns Hopkins University, and the University of Maryland School of Law. Steve, welcome to Delaware.
Jen, thanks so much. I appreciate the bio. Ellen, thank you for helping put this together. Russ, for whatever role you played, I do appreciate it. I always like virtually coming to Delaware. I'm right next door in Maryland, so I spend a fair amount of time in Delaware. I have a lot of good friends in Delaware. I spent a very quick aside. The summer of COVID, I spent most of my time at the Delaware Shore. So there you go. So I am a pseudo local, although I apologize if that is offensive. But I did my best to help the Delaware economy during COVID. As Jen said, I'm the regional political director for AIPAC. Although I am always happy to talk to a JCRC audience or a Federation audience, I consider that more of my ancestral home. I've professionally worked at AIPAC for about 9 years, but I've been on JCRC boards and Federation boards, kind of as long as I can remember. So I'm always happy to talk to a JCRC audience. I want to start today mainly talking about the Abraham Accords, kind of how the groundwork was laid, why we came to this time in history a couple months ago, for this historic agreement, the first of its kind in 26 years, normalizing relations between Israel and multiple other countries. Obviously, the first domino to fall for the Emiratis, United Arab Emirates, very quickly followed by Bahrain. And while it's not necessarily considered part of the Abraham Accords, I think you'd obviously mention the fact that Sudan followed relatively soon after those first two. But when we get to questions, and we'll move to kind of how the groundwork was laid, what does it mean? What could this mean moving forward? How has Congress reacted? How did a potential Biden administration as candidate react? How does a now soon to be sworn in Biden administration, handle the next 6, 12, 18 months? And then I'm also happy to just kind of take questions on anything having to do with the politics of the Middle East, the incoming administration, two states, Arab-Israeli conflict, you name it. Happy to kind of touch on it. So, like I said, I think you have to start any conversation about the Abraham Accords basically laying a groundwork of how we got here, right? So, Israel normalized relations with Egypt about 40 years ago. They normalized relations with Jordan in 1994, and then nothing from 94 to August 2020. So, what happened in those 26 years, or more importantly, what happened in the last few years to actually pave the way for these historic normalization agreements? There's a couple things that I want to touch on. I imagine many of them are not going to be foreign to you, not the first time you're hearing them, but if you use them to kind of paint a picture of what was happening in the Middle East the last couple of years, and why a country like UAE or Bahrain might have finally been pushed to enter into these agreements. I want to start with Iran. A lot of conversations I have about the Middle East often start with Iran. So why should this be any different? But Iran's growth in the region clearly laid a framework for countries that are opposed to Iran, which are most of the Gulf states, to have a heightened level of concern. So when they look around their neighborhood and they see obviously what's happening in Iran, their stated mission of achieving a nuclear weapons capable system over the last several decades, then you come to the JCPOA, you come to the 5 years post JCPOA, you look at Iran's growing influence in places like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, even further in places like, with Hamas in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, North Africa. You clearly see a country on the move, kind of expanding their tentacles, right? Trying to get their land bridge fully completed from Iran to the Mediterranean. And you are no fan of Iran's. So, with that as the backdrop of what's happened in the region, you're trying to figure out, if you're the Emiratis or Bahrain or potentially other countries moving forward, what can we do to prevent quite frankly, a larger engagement with Iran or further destabilization in the region? You saw what happened in Yemen. You saw what has happened, potentially destabilizing forces in Jordan. You experienced the Arab Spring, and now you're here. And then you actually see Iran's military getting ever more aggressive. You saw their debilitating attacks on the Saudi oil fields over a year ago, and you wonder, what could be next. I imagine we've all seen pictures of what Dubai and Abu Dhabi look like nowadays. I don't think they are looking for a full-scale, military intervention between them and Iran. So, you have that as kind of one piece of the puzzle, that has been laid in the Middle East, and then you layer on top of that a couple different pieces. You see what the United States has been doing in the region. You saw, about 8, 9 years ago, the U.S. pulling out forces from Iraq. In the last year and a half, my sense of time has kind of changed because of COVID. You see, U.S. pulling out most of their forces from parts of Syria. You see, just a general sense on the U.S.'s part that, they probably don't want to play as large an interventionist role in the Middle East as they have historically, at least for the last several decades. Layer that on top of the fact that Israel has arguably been taking a more interventionist role in the Middle East. There have been, by some reports, upwards of 2,000 different sortie missions by Israel into Syria or Iraq, kind of these pinpoint strikes at weapons depots or intelligence sources, mainly aimed at halting the spread of Iran's ability to influence Hezbollah or other non-governmental actors in the region. And you're the Emiratis or the Bahrainis or other Gulf states, and you say Iran is clearly growing in the region. They're clearly becoming more aggressive. Their military capability has been demonstrated and a willfulness to use it, whether it be in Saudi Arabia or Yemen, or by shipping weapons to Syria or the West Bank or whatever it might be. You see the U.S. potentially, lessening their presence, at least militarily, in the region, as far as boots on the ground go. And you see an Israel that has basically demonstrated the military will and has kind of, put the marker in the ground that they are here to stay. Not that that necessarily was a question 10, 20, 30 years ago, but that they really can kind of stand on their own militarily to the point where they're kind of taking on Iran head on. And then you look at the aftermath of the JCPOA, and regardless of kind of your personal political beliefs, whether you think it was a good deal or a bad deal, most people in the Middle East, particularly most of the Sunni states, view the JCPOA as an appeasement of Iran. And again, that is not a commentary on, what I think of the JCPOA. That is just kind of a public statement and private statement, quite frankly, of what you've seen over the last few years from these Sunni states, the Gulf states, of their takeaway from the JCPOA 5+ years ago. So now that brings us to today. That's just a little groundwork, right? So that's, where the region has stood. I would imagine for many of the Middle Eastern states, many of the Arab states, that's the equation that's running through their head. Now you have to look at what's happening in Israel, between Israel and her neighbors, particularly for sake of this conversation, because I imagine this will come up in questions. And I think this will be an important narrative, of the last 2 months of the Abraham Accords, 3 months of the Abraham Accords, as well as, the next decade moving forward, is the interplay between Israelis and Palestinians. Obviously, again, regardless of your personal political beliefs, there have been efforts made by both sides. We can argue to what extent those efforts have been made to come to some sort of two-state solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I can tell you both publicly and privately, many of these Middle Eastern countries, particularly the Gulf states, have started to feel that there is a level of Palestinian intransigence that is becoming problematic, and that actually there is a thread of thinking that the Palestinians were beginning to potentially act as a tool of Iran, right? So you look at Hamas. Obviously, Hamas does not speak for all Palestinians. I am not saying that Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are one, but they are in essence almost fully funded by Iran. And the ability for other countries, other Middle Eastern countries and Arab countries, to potentially use the Palestinian narrative between their attempts at a two-state solution between them and Israel, to be used against Israel on the international stage has become very powerful. So you have the flip side. You have these Gulf states, a lot of these Sunni Arab states, that are starting to kind of come to that way of thinking, and they're starting to say that we shouldn't be waiting for the Palestinians, quite frankly, to get out of their own way, to come to a two-state solution, to come to an agreement with Israel, before we begin to normalize relations with Israel, particularly given everything that I've already said. Israel taking the lead against Iran, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The U.S. playing a smaller role in the region. Iran's kind of breakneck growth in the region and near takeover of a lot of other of their surrounding countries, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, et cetera, et cetera. And then you could argue, you're not going to get anyone to publicly say this, at least you haven't yet, that the final straw, kind of the trigger that made all this happen with that groundwork already laid, was the most recent peace plan between the Trump administration, Israelis, and Palestinians, which seemingly paved the way for significant extension of sovereignty by Israel into much of the West Bank. And the sense, at least what you would hear publicly, is that that was almost the final straw, that a lot of these Gulf states wanted to kind of maintain the possibility of a two-state solution in the near future, and they felt like this was as good a time as any to finally, normalize relations with Israel, the economic advantages, the military advantages, the intellectual advantages, the intelligence sharing advantages, the tech opportunities that it would open up were finally too great to pass up. And that led us to August 2020. So why the Emiratis, right? Why UAE? Because I imagine many of us were surprised that mid-August day when it got announced. Maybe you'd started to hear rumblings a day or two prior. But why the Emiratis? Why not a larger, more historical player? Why not a smaller, kind of less critical player in the region? There's a lot of reasons why it made a lot of sense for the Emiratis to be the first country out of the gate, and then why it was kind of a natural progression for Bahrain to be kind of the next country off the board. So I don't know that many people on this call are experts on the United Arab Emirates. I know I wasn't. I've learned a lot about them in the last couple of years, but particularly the last couple of months. As we now probably know, the Emiratis are just a group of several different emirates, the two largest of which that I think we colloquially just generally think of when we think of UAE is Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi is actually by far kind of the largest piece of the Emiratis. Dubai is the economic engine of the Emiratis. And the demographics of the United Arab Emirates kind of, I think, speaks to a lot of why it was easier for them to be first. When you look at both not both, when you look at the demographics of the country, when you look at the leadership of the country, when you look at the normative split between state and religion of the Emiratis, it makes a lot of sense. So I just want to kind of break those things down one by one briefly. If you actually look at the entire Arab League, and you look at kind of which countries make up what percentage of the GDP of the entire Arab League, the Emiratis are actually they have the second largest GDP out of all the countries that make up the Arab League. They actually make up 15% of the total GDP, and that's with a population of about 1 million people. Comparatively speaking, historically, Egypt, generally the two kind of counterbalances in the Arab League have been Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Egypt is the third largest GDP in the Arab League, Saudi being one, with about 9%, and they have about 100 million people. So think about what the Emiratis have been able to do. Very small country, roughly 1 million people. And if you look at pictures of Dubai or main commercial centers of Abu Dhabi, say, you don't even have to go 100 years ago. You don't even have to go 50 years ago. You can look 20 years ago and today, and it's unbelievable. It's in essence New York being created in the span of 5 or 10 years, except much larger than New York, and it's quite something. If you actually look at that overall population of roughly 1 million people, about 80+% of them are actually guest workers, and many of those aren't Muslim. They're expats from the United States. They're from other parts of the world. They're people that are there doing business, high tech, tourism, energy. Energy is obviously a very large part of their economy. But there isn't this kind of decades-long generational, religious Muslim population there that is part of a government bureaucracy, kind of counter to many other countries in the Middle East. It's actually a very slimmed down bureaucracy, kind of very pro-business, pro-Western, pro-growth government and economy and bureaucracy. And that's mainly under the leadership of, you've probably started to hear MBZ relatively often now, Mohammed bin Zayed, who is in essence the de facto leader of the Emiratis. He's in his late 50s, educated in the West, mainly in Great Britain. And he came back and has been part of the royal family, obviously since birth, but he came back very pro-Western, pro-business, pro-growth. And he and his father have basically, over the last couple decades, have basically run a country where politics and religion don't mix. They do. It's unfair to say they don't, but they mix to a far lesser extent than most other Middle Eastern and Muslim countries that we're, used to hearing about. They have a significant tolerance for all strains of Islam, except where they will draw the line are on some of the more kind of radical elements, like the Muslim Brotherhood, Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, et cetera, et cetera. They actually have compulsory service in the Emiratis, and it's serious compulsory service. There are a few other Middle Eastern countries that do, but not nearly to the same extent. And they have actually played a vital role in almost all of the international military efforts of the last 2 or 3 decades. There were Emirati soldiers as part of the coalition in the first Gulf War, in Somalia, in Bosnia and Kosovo, in the Afghanistan War, in Libya in 2011, the anti-ISIS coalition. There are people in the US government, intelligence, and military planning that will tell you that any positives gained, kind of from the current civil war in Yemen being fought between, the Iranian-backed Houthis and, kind of a coalition mainly of Saudi and Emiratis, was due to Emirati military technology and intelligence. And that's a role that they have wanted to play for the last 20 plus years. They've actually been normalizing relations with the US and most of the Western world for much, much longer than obviously the last couple months. President George W. Bush actually visited the Emiratis in 2008, the first American president to visit. And they've had relatively warm relations in America ever since. So when you kind of lay all that out, it makes a lot of sense that they have the willpower, they had, the lack of kind of more fundamentalist strand within their government, that could potentially stop a normalization with Israel. They have the economic backing, they have the military power, and based on everything that I kind of started with, they have the need for these normalized relations. Just in the last 3 months, or 2.5 months since the Rose Garden signing, I guess that was September 15th, I might be off by a day or two, you've seen significant uptick in economic activity between both the Emiratis and Israel and the US. Obviously, we've all seen the articles about the first commercial flights and additional rabbis in the Emiratis and kosher restaurants and so on and so forth. But the economic drivers for this from the Emiratis perspective are limitless. And I think we're all excited to kind of see where that goes. I'm not going to take nearly as much time on Bahrain, but I think it's worth noting very briefly, and then I'll touch on Sudan, and then we'll move forward. Bahrain is not the same country as the Emiratis, and I'm sorry that I can't put a map up, but if you're, we're all at computers, so we all have the ability to kind of Google the map just so we can kind of see what we're talking about. But Bahrain and the Emiratis sit just across the water from Iran. And Emiratis are not a large, United Arab Emirates is not a large country, but Bahrain is much smaller. It's actually connected by a causeway with Saudi Arabia. At various points in its history over the last several hundred years, it's actually been a part of an Iranian regime. It's been part of the Saudi regime. It wasn't just until recently that it kind of became more of an independent country. But they are deathly afraid of Iran. And they don't have the military capability that their Emiratis have or the Saudis have. And their proximity to Iran is literally, we're talking here virtually in Delaware. It's not that much bigger than the Chesapeake Bay, right? We're not talking hundreds or thousands of miles between Bahrain and Iran. So they have a lot to be concerned about. They don't have their populace on the street is not nearly kind of as pro-Western as the Emiratis. But what they do have is they have a ruling Sunni class that is very closely aligned with the Saudis. And a name that became, we would hear every day over the last several years, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Again, you're not going to hear this publicly, but there's very much a sentiment that, Bahrain couldn't have done this without Saudi. In fact, it is likely that Saudi Arabia said to Bahrain, we're not going to leave the Emiratis out there by themselves. You guys are next. We'll back you. The sense being that the Emiratis could have made this decision on their own. The Bahrainis couldn't have. So whatever role Saudi Arabia played in kind of giving the okay on Bahrain, it's clear that they did. And that led us to the Abraham Accords and signed the agreement at the White House, I guess 2.5, almost 3 months ago at this point. Even though it wasn't technically part of the Abraham Accords, I feel like you have to mention Sudan. Obviously, the normalization of another Muslim majority country with Israel soon after. It's a totally different situation. There hasn't actually been anything formally signed. You in essence have a letter of intent between a temporary government in Sudan and Israel. As many of you probably know, Sudan was ruled by a fairly brutal dictatorship for decades. That reign recently came to an end. Over the last several decades, Sudan has harbored Al-Qaeda. They've harbored the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. There are not a whole lot of Muslim, Arab, Middle Eastern countries that can claim both. So I guess that's a feather in Sudan's cap. But, under this temporary government, there's a lot of reason that Sudan would want to have done this. Hopefully it gets there from their perspective. It gets them off of the American terror list, which will give them access to, a lot of international financial help that the country needs. It's an extremely poor country in significant need of economic aid. And from Israel's perspective, it helps them strategically. Air travel over Sudan makes Israeli commercial flight significantly easier to anywhere in Africa, anywhere in South America. It takes a level of strain off of Israel's mind militarily from the south. And more importantly, I think from Israel's perspective, is it's viewed as hopefully a domino into other Muslim countries in North Africa. And that's kind of where the Sudan agreement hopefully that kind of becomes formalized in the near future, hopefully leads to additional dominoes. That's kind of where I wanted to move, talking about what this could mean moving forward. I think there's two different strains of this conversation. There's kind of the Sudan strain, and then there's kind of the Gulf state strain. If you talk to people in the know, they will tell you the next couple of countries most likely to normalize relations with Israel are probably more in the Sudan model. Countries like Chad, Niger, we've been hearing about Morocco for about 6 months. But that would, whether we're talking Algeria or Libya, other countries, Muslim majority countries in North Africa, that would be a sea-changing event for a continent that had almost no ties to Israel in the not too distant past. And that's, kind of the hope of what Sudan brings to the normalization conversation in regards to, additional African countries and Israel. On, the Gulf state perspective, obviously, United Arab Emirates and Bahrain are both, Muslim Gulf states. Obviously, the question is Saudi Arabia. Does Saudi Arabia normalize relations? When? How? What does that mean for the rest of the region? What does that mean for Israel's safety and security? What does that mean, between Israel and Iran's, friction with the rest of, the Sunni Muslim world? And what does it mean for the Israelis and the Palestinians? Does that push the ball further down the field towards an eventual two-state solution or some sort of peaceful agreement between those two sides? No one knows what Saudi Arabia is going to do. I think there are assumptions that they will sooner rather than later. Some people think that is unlikely to happen until MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, formally takes over. His father passes away. It's not a foregone conclusion that if his father passes away, he would take over. There have been many, many times where the crown prince does not take over next. But seemingly, it would be much more likely that you would see a formal normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And obviously, a lot of us, I imagine, read about that kind of clandestine meeting between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Saudis maybe 2 weeks ago at this point. But it seems like a much more likely possibility if and when MBS formally takes over, Saudi Arabia. I think, and I'm obviously happy to get much more into this in questions. The other piece that I wanted to touch on briefly, and then we can go to questions, two pieces, although maybe I'll leave kind of the Biden administration, for more of a conversation, is the role of Congress in the Abraham Accords, and not that they had a direct role, but how did it play in Washington? How could it potentially play moving forward? What does it mean for the reality on the ground, in Washington? And, how could it potentially affect the U.S. Israel relationship, like nuts and bolts of what a lot of us care about, keeping Israel safe and secure. And, we at AIPAC, we focus most of our efforts on dealing with Congress, 435 House members and 100 senators. The Abraham Accords were overwhelmingly popular in Washington across party lines. I remember I was on Capitol Hill virtually the day of the signing ceremony. So yeah, it was September 15th, I believe. And I had maybe a dozen lobbying meetings with members of Congress. And everybody from your far right Republican to your far left Democrat that I spoke with was overwhelmingly in favor of it. Obviously, the perception of who was, who should be taking the credit was different depending on if you were in a Republican office or a Democratic office. But everyone was very much in favor of the agreement in principle and in reality, to the point where you had resolutions in both the House and the Senate. There was a resolution in the Senate. It was a Lindsey Graham, Bob Menendez, Todd Young, Ben Cardin. It's a mouthful. The four of them were the lead sponsors in the Senate resolution. They got 95 co-sponsors in a matter of a week or two. That doesn't happen on anything, particularly not virtually in a campaign season. So for anyone on this call that had any part in that, particularly obviously for this call, reaching out to Senator Coons, Senator Carper, Congresswoman Blunt Rochester, thank you. In the House, similar resolution. It was an Engel, McCall, Rose, Zeldin resolution at 385 co-sponsors almost immediately in the House. You shouldn't take that for granted, that anything 2 months before an election in COVID virtual hyper-partisanship world gets those kinds of numbers. And I would like to believe that should be evidence to everyone across the political spectrum and a Biden administration moving forward, how popular the notion of normalizing relations in the Middle East between Israel and her neighbors is in the US. It has led to things more recently in the last month or two that you've probably seen in the news. It almost immediately led to a contract to sell F-35s, which is the U.S. Air Force's, kind of most advanced fighter plane at this point, to the Emiratis, which has led to a lot of conversations in Washington, and this is something that I deal with a lot, on maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge, without backtracking, more than 30 seconds or so. Israel obviously realized decades ago that it was never going to be the largest presence in the Middle East. It was never going to have the population or the numbers that a lot of her enemies, at least at the time, had. So she had to ensure that she had better military capabilities. And that was actually codified into law with the foreign aid that Israel receives from the United States, that the United States would always guarantee in their sales of weapon systems to other Middle Eastern countries that Israel would maintain her QME, her qualitative military edge. And that has been a topic of conversation in this sale of these F-35s to the Emiratis. But presumably because of the early success of the Abraham Accords, Israel has not had a problem with the sale to the Emiratis. The reality on the ground is the planes won't be delivered probably for 7, 8, 9, 10 years. It's just the nature of how long it takes for planes to be made and for this process to be finalized and delivered, and the training of people on the ground there. So I think there's an assumption that, and by law, the United States will be forced to maintain Israel's QME, given the Emiratis soon to have these planes in the next several years. But that has been a kind of a long-going conversation in general, and specifically on this sale in Washington in the last month or two, on something that we are at AIPAC at least very cognizant of. I could go on about how the Abraham Accords affects, directly the U.S. Israel relationship and Israel's relationship with her neighbors that have not necessarily normalized relations. And there's a significant amount to say about what a Biden administration is likely to do in the next 6, 12 months, 2 years, to kind of keep these dominoes rolling. I imagine there's an entire separate conversation about what this means for the Arab-Israeli conflict and two-state solution, but I'm going to guess that a lot of that will be covered in Q&A. So I've been talking for a while, so maybe I will stop there and see what questions everyone has.
Okay, awesome. We actually have had fairly active questions in the chat. So with your patience, I've gone ahead and know them. We'll start going through them if that works.
Sure.
Cool.
I'm all yours.
Okay, well, I'm going to take chairs. I'm going to take my chair's benefit as the first one. And this is a conversation I had with someone last night. What effect do you think? What effect might another round of new Israeli elections affect additional Abraham type accords or the peace process in general?
So it's still not totally clear. If Israel is going to go to new elections, it shouldn't be shocking to anyone on this call that nothing's clear in Israeli politics. But if we do have our 4th round of elections in roughly 2 years, which I don't know all the history, but I would imagine is relatively historic, it's hard to see Likud being led by someone other than Bibi Netanyahu. And it would be hard to see a prime minister coming to power from a further right party than Likud. So presumably you'd be looking at a coalition government if they were to be able to form a coalition, obviously, which is clearly a challenge. Either a Likud-led government or some sort of kind of blue and white-ish, more centrist-led government. Point being, I don't know that you're going to have the next coalition after potentially elections in the next couple months that would want to more aggressively push for annexation expansion. Clearly, that was a likely trigger to kind of, finalizing these accords. And presumably, annexation expansion might put a halt to further normalization. So I don't know that, kind of a further right figure in the Likud world or in another party would rise to power in a new coalition government, which would endanger these. I mean, you do see stories out of Israel that, a lot of the organized settler movements have been opposed to the Abraham Accords because they think it's directly tied to Israel's, refusal to acknowledge, to expand sovereignty to where they live in certain settlement blocks. But that is a very small minority of the conversation happening in Israel. So short of a further right figure than Bibi taking the reins in Likud or a totally different coalition government that you couldn't foresee right now, I would only imagine it would help Also, what do politicians like, particularly politicians running for election? They like things that are popular with their people and things that bring in more money to the country, particularly as the whole world kind of slowly claws out of COVID. So I would imagine it would be in everyone's best interest, just politically, to at least make it seem like there will be additional dominoes fall sooner rather than later.
Thank you. So next question up actually was out of the gate from one of our Federation past presidents who's on the call today, Suzanne Grant. And she was asking, is there a concern about Iran in the aftermath of the death of that nuclear scientist?
Susie, how are you doing? Sorry, I can't see you right now. You know, obviously I am not, I don't work for the CIA, contrary to what some people might think. I'm not in the Iranian intelligence corps. It seems like the conversation has turned into that they won't, at least not in kind of an overt, large way, retaliate for the death of the Iranian scientist. They're very much in wait and see of what may or may not happen with U.S. reentry in the JCPOA, some sort of renegotiated JCPOA. And I think they're just walking on eggshells right now. And I think they don't want to give the incoming administration a reason to, maybe put more pressure on them than they otherwise might have. So I think the widely held perception is that nothing's going to kind of on a large scale overtly happen. It wasn't exactly your question, but there are a lot of people that are concerned that, the Abraham Accords could lead to heightened tensions between Iran and the Gulf states. Is Bahrain, are the Emiratis, is the Saudi Peninsula kind of more at risk from heightened tensions and potentially direct military strikes from Iran? And quite frankly, I mean, I can't tell you the answer is yes or no, but that's part of the reason for the normalization, to increase the coalition, kind of the anti-Iranian coalition that exists in the Middle East. So clearly something that we would be paying attention to. I mean, I think the perception is that Iran for the last 12 or 18 months has basically just been trying to wait out this American election with the hopes that they would be in a better bargaining position under a Biden administration than Trump administration, at least diplomatically. So I think they don't want to rock the boat in the next couple months while kind of that plays itself out, the beginning of a Biden foreign policy.
Well, since we were actually a nice segue into that, we did have a question about Biden administration in Iran. What effect will refinancing Iran by the Biden administration have on attacks by Hezbollah and Hamas, in your opinion? I'm
sorry, just say the first half of that again.
Questions from Jonathan Cates. What effect will refinancing Iran by the Biden administration have on attacks by Hezbollah and Hamas, I guess, in your opinion?
So refinancing Iran, I'm not sure if you're referring to 5 years ago, the unfreezing of the money, that obviously wasn't under a Biden administration, or just moving forward.
Some sort of. Yeah.
I don't think anyone knows what's going to happen. I mean, as a candidate, and in the months since the election, president-elect, I guess he's president-elect now, not vice president. I don't know what the formal title would be, but President-elect Biden has made it clear that domestic policy, COVID, economic relief, racial injustice, climate change are going to be his focuses. But if there is something in the foreign policy realm that he will focus on early on, it would be a potential return to the JCPOA. But he's given an important caveat, and from our perspective, because I focus a lot on this, this is the key. He has never said, the Democratic debates in the primary, any public statements he's made in the last year or so, he's never said he just wants to re-enter back into the JCPOA. He has said he wants to re-enter back into a properly renegotiated JCPOA, given the change of the facts on the ground from 5 years ago. I imagine many of you have relationships with Senator Coons. This is kind of the same language he's been using for the last couple of years since the JCPOA was originally signed. But the Biden administration is clearly open to diplomacy and re-engaging Iran, and wants to re-engage Iran, and wants to do that with their other international partners, the original P5+1 and other international organizations. But they understand that the realities on the ground have changed since 2015, and are very cognizant of that before re-entering into anything. I think Biden said publicly, maybe several days ago at this point, or about a week ago, that any rapprochement with Iran would have to include their state sponsorship of terror, their missile delivery system capabilities, most of which were not considered during the original JCPOA. So there seems to be, and by the way, the people that he has nominated so far, specifically Tony Blinken at State, and his national security advisor, and there was talks of Michelle Flournoy at Defense, but that hasn't been finalized yet. All of those people were kind of the wing of the Obama camp during the JCPOA that were probably pushing for a slightly stronger JCPOA. So it's very much in line with kind of that wing of the negotiating team from 5 years ago, and Biden's public statements over the last year. So I don't know if that danced around the question, but I kind of just talked about the new administration re-entering the Iran deal. So
well, I'm not seeing any problem in the comments. I'm thinking it looks like you probably at least hit some of what you're looking for. John Kerry, bad news was the comment in the comments. So.
Yeah, I mean, he has, so John Kerry will hold a seat on the National Security Council, but, it's been made fairly clear that his focus is going to be exclusively climate change. Like, is he going to be a person in the room giving his opinion? If a larger universe of people is talking about a return to JCPOA, probably. But I mean, this is not something that he's going to focus on. And I mean, he's clearly a known commodity. People know where his head was at 5 years ago and where it is now. I don't think he's going to railroad Tony Blinken or Jake Sullivan or Joe Biden, when he is going to be focused on this. I mean, Joe Biden talked about climate change a significant amount, and it has clearly been heightened by appointing John Kerry as kind of the climate change czar. So I would think he'll have his hands mainly full with that.
Okay. So we have a question came in from Russ Silberglade, from our friend Russ, asking you to comment on the fundamental difference of the Abraham Accords from the existing peace with Egypt and Jordan when it comes to the friendliness of the arrangement, culture, business, and education of youth. So it seems much warmer. It's only 3 months old now, I guess. But it seems likely that it will be much warmer. Also, I mean, there's so many differences. So I'm just thinking in my head for a second where to start. There wasn't direct military conflict between Israel and the Emiratis and Bahrain, or really the Gulf states at large. Whereas for the 30 years prior to normalization with Egypt, it was almost a constant struggle in the Sinai and various borders of Israel. And to this day is still generally referred to as a cold peace. Jordan obviously has the longest border with Israel, and fought in many direct wars, fought in coalitions of many wars directly against Israel prior to '94. I think maybe the largest difference other than that, though, is the feeling on the street. I would imagine Israel's favorables are not particularly high to the every man and woman on the street in Cairo or Amman or the rest of Egypt and Jordan, whereas just the demographic differences that exist, particularly in the Emirates. If you're in Dubai or Abu Dhabi, people don't hate Israel. It's just not a fundamental part of their life to hate Israel. Or Jews, quite frankly. I mean, they have record low anti-Semitism in those countries, at least compared to other Middle Eastern or Muslim majority countries. And that mainly starts at the top. Like I said, since the Emiratis kind of rise to power over the last 2-ish decades,
they have worked very, very hard to divorce politics and religion, and they're much more kind of pro-Western in their political leanings, in how they practice their religion, and how they prioritize economic growth. And for all those reasons, that's why the Abraham Accords made a lot of sense. And directly to your question, I think for all those reasons, I would imagine over the next decade, it'll be much different than kind of the cold peace that was mainly developed on, security cooperation between Israel and Egypt and Jordan.
Looks like we probably have time for one or two more questions. Before I go to my list, I want to make sure that if any of the attendees have questions they wanted to ask, please put them in the chat. I don't like to monopolize with my list. Okay, then I'll ask my question. Knowing that a lot of your work is focused on Israel, but what have you? But I imagine you hear a lot of other things as well. What's the word out there? What are the Palestinians saying? What are Hamas saying about these accords? Do we know?
So surprisingly, they're not in favor. I think it's for obvious reasons. It weakens their position. Part of the Palestinian narrative, or most of the Muslim world narrative for the last 40 plus years, 50 years, kind of since the Six-Day War, has been, solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict first, and then we can talk about everything else. And this, kind of directly pierces that veil. It's very hard for them to continue that narrative, to say that the Israelis aren't willing to negotiate, they're not a partner for peace, when they just made peace with 3 Muslim majority countries. And seemingly other countries are thawing their relations with Israel. So it clearly weakens their position. When you go to the Arab League meeting in Khartoum, right, in Sudan 50 years ago, and you had the 3 no's, and then you zoom forward to 2 or 3 months ago to the Arab League's meeting post-Abraham Accords, and you couldn't even get them to denounce the Abraham Accords. So you just see where kind of the Arab world at large has gone over those 50 years as it pertains to directly working with Israel. I would imagine this is my name drop. I had a meeting with a small number of people with Saeb Erekat just before COVID. And I would imagine it was a pretty honest conversation. And this question wasn't asked because the Abraham Accords weren't a thing yet. But I would imagine his public answer would be that they're horrible and so on and so forth. But his private answer would be, well, guess we gotta we gotta figure something out now. Because they're just negotiating from such a weaker position right now, when you have the rest of the Arab world normalizing relations before making kind of concrete progress towards a 2-state solution. Israel is clearly a partner for peace and clearly willing to sit down at the table. It just depends what the terms are. It just kind of ruins their argument. So, there will come a time, you'd like to believe, there will come a time where the 2 sides will come to an agreement, a reasonable agreement, that meets as much as possible of both sides' needs. But now they're negotiating from a much weaker place than they were. They looked a lot better 6 months ago, when most of the Arab world, or 9 months ago, let's say, when most of the Arab world was opposed to the unrolling of the Trump peace plan. But to think of, kind of where public outcry in the Muslim world went from then to not opposing the Abraham Accords maybe 6 months later, it's a pretty stark reality, new reality for the Palestinians, I would think.
Yeah. I mean, so you think, within the Arab League, there'll be kind of, there's always the argument, well, we don't have a partner for peace. Do you think that they're being questioned, behind doors? And, well, clearly there is. Where is your partner for peace?
I would imagine.
Yeah.
I would imagine. All right.
Right.
Anything else?
No other questions. So if you wanted to leave us with a final thought about the situation, what's going on right now, what would be your final thought for us as we go back to the workday?
All right. So final thought, I'll go back to kind of my bread and butter, not necessarily the Abraham Accords, but I think there's a lot of reason for hope. I don't know everyone on this call's personal political beliefs. I would imagine everyone on this call has very strong views on the current president, either positive or against, as well as the incoming president. Obviously, Delaware, Rehoboth real estate just got much more expensive. But I would say there's reason for hope on the U.S. Israel relationship with the incoming Congress, with the incoming administration. There's a lot of concern about where elements of both parties are on this issue. And I think a lot of that has been allayed by Biden win, by some of the nominees that he has put forward so far, some of the public statements he's made. And, I look race by race on a congressional level of who's leaving and who's going, who's coming to Washington, who's leaving Washington. And there are some challenges. I'm not going to lie and say there are no challenges with this incoming Congress and an anti-Israel, kind of sentiment, in certain corners of Capitol Hill come January 3rd. But there's much more reason for optimism than despair that this incoming Congress will have Israel's back and believes very, very strongly in a very close and strong U.S. Israel relationship. And the Biden administration won't be a problem for the incoming Biden administration.
Okay. Well, thank you, Steve, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Stephen. As always, your comments are very enlightening and stimulating. We appreciate it. And it appears that Wilmington, Delaware, seems to be the epicenter of the world for the time being.
Yeah, we're talking about the inaugural Amtrak ride from Wilmington to Washington on January 20th. So, he has to take an Amtrak train.
Of course.
To Union Station and then walk, up to the Capitol.
Absolutely. So we look forward to learning from you again in the future. Thank you to all of you for attending. And have a wonderful day and stay safe, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye. This concludes the program.